The views expressed in this blog are hosted on my own website, are strictly personal, and do not reflect the views of any organization.
Hello and welcome friends once again to Straight Bat. Namaskar, my weekly video blog where, as the title suggests, I comment with a straight bat. Now, a few days ago when I heard the BJP spokesperson Gaurav Bhatia describe the BBC as a Bhrasht Bakwas Corporation, I was a little taken aback. Not because I expected anything better from Mr Bhatia. He is, after all, a rather voluble BJP spokesperson, a spokesperson of a political party which is at war with the BBC at the moment, and you could argue all is fair in war and politics. And yet, for many in my generation, the BBC was and is the original gold standard of journalism. I recall traveling to report on an earthquake in Latur in 1993. I was in the Times of India at the time. It was a terrible earthquake. More than 10,000 people died. An entire village had been flattened. And as I was covering the earthquake, someone came from one of the villages to see me and said, "Sir, apan BBC un aat ka? Are you from the BBC?" He asked me in Marathi very excitedly. Now, this was the pre-24/7 private TV age, an age where news on the electronic medium was confined to the official broadcaster, good old Doordarshan. The official broadcaster would tell you what the government wanted to tell you or what the government wanted you to know. If you wanted to get the real story, you often turned to BBC, especially BBC Radio. I distinctly recall that on December 6th, 1992, I was in Mumbai, again at the Times of India office there, the day when the Babri Masjid was demolished. It was only when the BBC had confirmed the news that we were convinced of the authenticity of what had happened in Ayodhya. Go back further in time. Indira Gandhi's assassination, October 31st, 1984, or indeed her defeat, famously in 1977, or the Bhopal gas tragedy of December 1984, it was the BBC that was seen as the most reliable source of information at the time on the really big story. The face and the voice of the BBC for more than one generation during this period, for many Indians, was Mark Tully, Sir Mark Tully, former correspondent and bureau chief of the BBC for more than 30 years. Sir Tully was barred from entering India during the emergency of 1975 to 77 when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had imposed her censorship curbs on the media. And yet, interestingly, Rajiv Gandhi reportedly turned to Tully Saab, as he was fondly called by many, to confirm the death of his mother in 1984. The same Mark Tully or Tully Saab was chased and targeted by a mob of car sevaks when he was reporting on the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and he had to be taken and hidden away in a small temple in Ayodhya. And yet, through all these ups and downs, Sir Mark Tully was deeply invested in India, telling the story of a changing India, chronicling it with passion and diligence. When I first moved to Delhi in 1994, one of the first persons I met was Sir Tully. It was my fan moment, and what I discovered was a kind and gentle human being with a ready smile, old-style courtesies, and a bag full of anecdotes that he was more than ready to share with a young journalist at the time. I refer today to the legendary Tully only to contrast the values that he stood for in contrast with the rather uncivil manner in which Mr Bhatia has chosen to target the BBC today. For the Tully generation, the BBC represents values of truth, of experience, of credibility. In many ways, that still holds. I know that this is a post-BBC generation that has been fed on so many popular private news channels. But let me be blunt today. How many of these private news channels, who often do little else but parrot the government agenda, can really hold a candle to the BBC's journalism? What are the arguments against the BBC? The income tax authorities claim to be investigating alleged transfer pricing irregularities in the BBC's accounts. But apparently these irregularities have been the subject of tax notices to the broadcaster dating back to 2002-03. Nothing, one gathers, came out of those inquiries, which in fact the BBC has contested. So how come suddenly, just weeks after the BBC airs a contentious documentary on the Gujarat violence of 2002, does the tax department revive an old issue? Are we to seriously therefore believe that there is no connection between the tax surveys and the BBC documentary that was critical of the then Modi government in Gujarat? I have said this before. Either the government should have rebutted the BBC point by point, fact by fact on its documentary, or ignored it altogether. By first blocking the telecast, and now with these IT inquiries being carried out in the manner that they are, the government is sending out the wrong message. A, that it has something to possibly hide, and B, that it will be vindictive and target any media house who criticizes the government. The other argument which is being made against the BBC, and not for the first time, is that it is anti-India. Okay, so the BBC's coverage of Kashmir in particular over the years, that has often focused on human rights violations, is contentious, for example. But since when did a critique of the government of India's policies in Kashmir become equated with being anti-India? We have to separate the government of India from India. Surely India is a strong and resilient democracy that can easily deal with such criticism. Remember, this is the same BBC which was critical of its own government when exposing former Prime Minister Boris Johnson recently on the infamous Partygate scandal. Maybe the BBC, you could argue, still has an slightly Orientalist view of India at times. But to call it anti-India as a result, frankly, is a bit of a stretch. Now we are also told that the BBC is running an anti-India propaganda because it is being funded by Chinese-owned companies. Again, this is a rather strange and perplexing argument. How can we forget that this is the same BBC which in February 2021 was banned by the Chinese government from broadcasting in the country for reporting on the coronavirus and the persecution of the ethnic minority Uyghurs. An organization banned by the Chinese is now accused of running an anti-India agenda on the behest of the same Chinese government? Give me a break, please. Truth is, the BJP is guilty of falling into the same trap that once led Indira Gandhi to expel the BBC from this country in 1970. The BBC's crime then? It had screened a documentary that showed poverty on the streets of Kolkata. The socialist government of Indira Gandhi clearly didn't want to be shown the darker side of India. The people of the country should not have been exposed, it seemed, to the grim reality in the age of Garibi Hatao slogans. And therefore, Mrs. Gandhi's government asked the BBC to leave the country for vitiating the minds of the British people against India. Now, the Modi government is doing an Indira Gandhi redux or a repeat by threatening and intimidating the BBC to fall in line after its Gujarat documentary. The Indira Gandhi government then had an absolute majority in parliament. So does the Modi government today. Why should such powerful governments be so paranoid of what the BBC broadcasts? And why really should the Modi government in 2023, led by a leader who fought against the emergency, now turn to Indira Gandhi's excesses to justify its actions against the BBC today? Oh, one last thing. In 2013, at a news media event, this is what a senior politician said, and I quote, "This is our media world. There was a time when we had Akashvani, Doordarshan and a limited number of newspapers. What was the talk amongst the common man then? They used to say, I heard it on the BBC. They had no faith in Doordarshan. Newspapers were published at huge costs, but they also were not trusted. This credibility is in contrast to the lack of credibility in the government organizations is, I believe, a great danger." Just take a guess, my friends, who is the politician who's uttered these words? His name is Narendra Modi. Yes, Mr. Modi too, like me, belongs to the Tali Saab generation. Think about it. That was the straight bat. Do of course subscribe to my YouTube channel for many more such videos. For now, stay well, stay safe. Jai Hind. Namaskar.